Now we look at the past and future of People Express from three different perspectives. First, we have Julius Maldutis, who watches the airline industry for Salomon Brothers, and David Lewin, a labor specialist at Columbia's Business School in New York. Mr. Lewin, this was a success story. What happened?
It was a success story. I think the answer to what happened is fairly succinct. This is a case of a business that expanded rapidly as a startup and did very well, and partly because it did so well, thought it could continue to expand extremely rapidly in the next phases of its growth. It found out the hard way that it cannot do that, and I think that's the simple bottom line for People Express. Too much growth, too rapidly.
You agree with that, Mr. Maldutis?
I would take partly an exception to that. It wasn't growth per se that caused this company's problems. It was quite successful when it flew in non-competitive markets, to the small cities. As its success spread and its fleet increased, it entered markets of the very large established carriers who had a vested interest in the Chicago, Minneapolis, Los Angeles, San Francisco routes. This entry into the large markets came also at a very bad timing because the large carriers realized the growing threat that People's Express and Continental produced for them, and they began to match them on pricing action. So I think it was not only the growth itself, but the direction of the growth that caused these problems.
What were the consequences, the bad consequences of growing too fast?
Well,
for customers and within the airline.
Yes, well, the figures you cited in terms of the financial performance of the company is, I think, the most significant bottom line result. The increasing frequency of customer complaints, lost baggage, and I think most particularly, given the notion of trying to entice business travelers, the increase in delayed flights and canceled flights. One must remember that People Express started out as an airline without a mechanic or a maintenance person, and that is still true today. They subcontracted all of that work. And as Mr. Maldutis says, when they were doing that in the local markets, the regional routes, that was fine. But when they started to compete with American, TWA, and United, who have subsidiaries that are servicing People Express's planes, it doesn't take a genius to figure out that those airlines may say, we're not going to give them the service on time and perhaps the quality they deserve. So I think there are numerous effects, and perhaps later on we can talk about the effects on employees, which I count among the most significant.
Well, we can discuss those now. People was not only innovative in its prices, it was innovative in its in the way it worked its employees. I mean, what happened there?
Well, I think the great success story to People's Express is still to be told.
We should just summarize how it was innovative with its
innovative
employees.
In the sense that there were approximately 35,000 unemployed airline people whose skills were not readily transferable, that Mr. Burr had a very great labor pool that was available. He also formed a very different management structure and a management philosophy that was diametrically opposite to what was known in the industry. It was participation management, it was group management. I think our colleague here can expound on that some more.
And what happened to it?
Well, just one other point. It was not only that, which I quite agree with, but for the largest employee group in the airline, the customer service manager, who performed several functions, this company said the one thing you can't have is airline experience. And it hired school teachers, social workers, and nurses, largely young women, into these jobs, promised them opportunity, growth, profit sharing, required stock ownership, as it did with the former pilots. So you had a tremendous goodwill and morale among this workforce in its early years. What I think has happened now is that that morale has turned down. Turnover has increased substantially, including most recently of Mr. Peretti, the president, and Ms. Dubois, the personnel manager. Folks who would have come to work for People Express in '82 and '83 and maybe '84 are now looking askance at the airline. And that's not something you can just jerk around and recapture a market on.
With the big loss in the first quarter and a projected big loss, I gather, in the second quarter of the year, what are the options for People Express tonight, Mr. Maldutis?
I think there are several, one of which it has to change its basic business strategy and decouple itself from the highly competitive markets, namely go back to its original route strategy. Second, its liquidity position, which I estimate is about $50 million today.
What does that mean, liquidity?
$50 million in cash.
But with a lot of debts.
With a lot of debts, approximately $800 million in debt for the company today. I think it will have to sell some of its larger aircraft, namely the 747s, and it may in fact have to dispose of Frontier Airlines, which has turned out to be, I think, a bad strategic
But can
move.
it stay in business as an independent entity itself, People Express, or will it have to sell itself out to somebody else like Texas Air?
I don't think at this point that question can be answered. I believe that there is a market for companies such as People's Express. It all depends on the strategy that management will follow.
What do you see as the options?
I would add one possible additional option to either being taken over in part or in whole or going out of business. Those are the two options being discussed widely now. But go back to the point of employees. Every full-time employee in the business is required to own stock. Every one of them participated in a profit-sharing plan that has yielded nothing.
How many are there?
Oh, you're talking roughly 4,000 full-time employees. One other option is that employees might buy this airline. Their future was tied to it. And if the options they face are liquidate the business or being taken over by an unknown, such as Mr. Lorenzo, who may be a bit more known
Who
than
runs
unknown,
Texas Air.
Texas Air, Continental, and the rest, employees may decide that this is an option and they may take some action in that respect. I don't think it should be discounted fully.
Okay, gentlemen, we'll come back. Jim?
A third opinion now from Alfred Kahn, who is often called the father of airline deregulation. It came into being when he was chairman of the late Civil Aeronautics Board in the Carter administration. He now teaches political economy at Cornell University, and he joins us from WCNY in Syracuse, New York. People Express was considered a child of airline deregulation, so that makes you the grandfather of People Express. Is that right, Mr. Kahn?
Yes, and I'm very sad about the recent news about People Express.
What went wrong, in your opinion?
Well, I think it was the combination of circumstances that the other two, Professor Lewin and Mr. Maldutis, have been talking about. There were clearly mistakes made by the management of People Express. They grew way beyond their capacity to practice the kind of management style that they had and to be able to give the good quality of service that they previously gave. The side of it that I think perhaps they haven't emphasized quite enough is the fact that People Express, its fate is not unique. We've had enormous numbers of failures, particularly among the new entrant airlines, and the industry does seem to be turning around and becoming somewhat more concentrated than it was before. There are advantages that the major carriers have had that when they were directly challenged by People Express, they began to exert with a will.
And is that where the future lies, do you think? We're going to end up with fewer but very big airlines?
Well, I think that is the trend. That does not mean that I think that competition in the industry is dying out. It's obviously because competition is so effective and intense that we've had these large-scale failures, especially among the new entrant airlines.
Well, explain that. I mean, deregulation was supposed to foster competition. It fostered,
surely has done.
And it did, and now it's destroyed competition.
Well, I think that's an exaggeration, Jim. You look at American industry generally, you find that they go through a period of shaking down, and often the industries come to be dominated by a relatively small number of firms. The airline industry, any airline industry that has, let's say, 6 major integrated firms, which seems to me, it's hard to believe it would be less than that, that includes among its numbers a Texas Air, a Continental, which is a very low-cost and aggressive price-cutting carrier, that includes a Southwest Airlines and an America West. That's an industry that is not going to be, or now a Presidential, that has the romance to people of every year new people want to form new airlines, and entry is relatively easy. That's not going to settle into sluggish, slovenly, monopolistic ways, I don't think.
But back to your point, it was the ability of the big airlines, the established airlines, American, United, Delta, and so on, to react to people that caused people to get hurt, correct?
That's right. And you have to recognize that the competition has been so intense in the last year or so that while consumers have clearly benefited, fares were at levels, yields have been at levels that really were not sustainable. The whole industry has been losing money practically in the first half of this year. So that I don't regard it as catastrophic in itself if the industry becomes somewhat more stable and competition more sustainable. We're not going to the extreme, I mean, of ending up with one firm monopolizing the whole market.
But in other words, if I'm interpreting correctly what you're saying, the industry no longer needs People Express.
Well, I think it needs the threat of the possibility of new People Expresses springing up. And as I say, look at Presidential. Now, I'm not saying that I know that Presidential will survive out of Dulles, but that's the one that...
That's Presidential Airways that started, what, about a year ago,
yeah,
right?
With the